In their first 4 years, children have learned to express themselves. It's a tremendous achievement. The young artist dabbles with language. Playing at being a grown-up, learning to use grown-up words and phrases, spinning whole sentences, telling stories, involves weaving through the intricacies of grammar and syntax. How they manage it is cloaked in mystery. For centuries, it was taken for granted. Children learned language by a process of imitation, reward, and habit. But in the 1950s, a new theory proposed a language acquisition device unique to humans, wired into the brain. It's now 25 years since linguists and psychologists were shaken into reappraising the state of their art by Noam Chomsky.
One of the faculties of the human mind is the faculty of language learning. I would think we must agree with Descartes that this is probably, no doubt, I think, a species-specific characteristic, a unique property of the human mind. And in trying to determine what the faculty of language might be, we look at the very difficult empirical problem of explaining how it is that a young child with very limited information available to him acquires a system of language and knowledge of language that enables him to produce and understand this vast number of new sentences.
We have to be grateful to Chomsky for having introduced the idea that shook us out of a kind of dogmatic slumber in which we were caught with St. Augustine's model of imitation and learning. But what was curious about the tremendous breakthrough of rethinking it is that when he proposed a language acquisition device, he did it, first of all, without any evidence, proposing it as an hypothesis that there were too few instances for the child to come up with so complicated a set of ideas as are contained in grammar. And to get away from all the empiricist dogma that had gone before, he proposed that the language acquisition device could simply take as its input whatever was going in language, even degenerate input, semi-grammatical sentences, and this miraculous device, knowing the deep structure of the language, could then somehow bang it out and pick up what in effect were the rules of the language.
I think the people at MIT, or the Chomskyans, tend to believe that the language acquisition device simply springs into activation if one is exposed to language. And the rest of us have begun to think that you need something beyond exposure. You need interaction to acquire language.
We always have an interaction between the environment and the innate capacity. So the arguments between nativism and empiricism are really posed as polar opposites, when the issue is not so much is it innate or is it environmental, but the issue is how do these interact? What kinds of innate capacities does the child need in order to make use of what the world provides? If we pose a question this way, a lot of the heat of it is dissipated, and then the question becomes the hard scientific work of trying to specify just what built-in processes are necessary to account for this particular developmental history.
Where to begin? Investigators disagree. Evidence is accumulating for some innate basis for language acquisition. Could the baby be learning the characteristics of speech while still in the womb? Or is it with the first cry that language begins? Here at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, 4-day-old Debbie has her cries analyzed by Dr. Barry Lester.
Her cry is good and lusty. When she initially started crying, there was a period where she held her breath for a long time, which is how a painful kind of cry usually starts. But her cry has a good melody form, and it's a nice, robust cry. And what's also very nice about her is that she quiets by herself. She's very expressive. I mean, she has a lot of affect in her face, yet she's not out of control. She's able to pretty much calm herself.
Barry Lester monitors the cries of newborn babies for acoustic properties. His research integrates the behavior of the baby on the video screen with a computer system which plots respiratory rate, heart rate, and the analog cry signal. What does the sound of Debbie's cry tell us about later language development?
we look at adult speech has what are called prosodic qualities to it, meaning intonation and voice patterns and pitch patterns. It also has grammar and syntax. I mean, those are the two components of adult speech. Well, crying has only the prosodic components. Crying is changes in pitch and intonation and melody patterns.
Crying has at least two of the qualities of speech. It'll be 3 or 4 months before Debbie's vocal tract and larynx has developed sufficiently to make sophisticated speech sounds. In these early weeks, there are significant developments in the discovery of new sounds. Peter Wolf.
This, quote, discovery of new sounds is done primarily when the baby is by itself, and particularly in the transition from being alert and quiet to beginning to cry. There is this fussy period, and it's there that we find the discovery of new kinds of sounds. And they then become a part of non-cry vocalizations when the baby is perfectly alert. And there, I think you see the beginning of experimental manipulations of sounds while they're perfectly content. And it is the discovery of different patterns of sound production that may be the linkage between crying and language. That does not mean that cry patterns are directly built into the language system, but it is the transition from cry to fussy to the discovery of new sounds that may be, at least at the physiological level, the tie with learning how to speak the language.
Hearing has as much to do with language learning as voicing. An infant's ear is fully formed early in development. Barry Lester tests Debbie's responses to the rattle. But what does she make of the stream of sounds around her? How will she distinguish speech from other sounds? In the Department of Engineering at Cambridge, efforts have been made to decode speech sounds and present them visually. The display gives us a clue to the complexity of every word and the task facing a baby. Frank Forsyth explains.
The first group of sounds are the voice sounds. These include the vowels, ah, eh, oo, and so on, and sounds like and Now, these are shown a clear, solid trace. The second group of sounds are hissing sounds, fricative sounds, voice sounds with a lot of high frequency energy in them. Sounds like s, sh, f, and so on. These are shown in a different way in the trace. So, for example, s now comes up as a checkered pattern. If you now add these into words, clearly the different patterns show up during the word. So if we take a word like see, you see the unvoiced sound at the beginning and then the voice part at the end. If we take another word, wash.
And there's a third element, silence.
Watch, where we have the voiced part, a gap, and then the unvoiced part at the end.
If that seems complex, listen to this. Elizabeth is 4 weeks old. She's fed the sound da every time she sucks. When she gets bored, her rate of sucking slows. It picks up again when the sound changes to ta. She's interested. The experiment was designed to test babies' responses to change in speech sounds. Its designer, Peter Imas.
These infants, very young infants, are extremely sensitive to the information that's in the speech signal, that is, to the acoustic parameters that are there. And the second thing it tells us, I believe, is that they have some very nice abilities to categorize speech, that is, to sort sounds into the kinds of categories that in a few months will come to have linguistic significance. What it tells us is that there's a strong biological component to the processing of speech and to the perception of speech. That is, our inheritance helps us understand speech, helps us to perceive speech. You get a start on the system. You know what categories are going to be important. you know how to sort the sounds into these categories.
Are babies born with the capacity to distinguish sounds? If they have this innate capacity, how is it used in this situation? Breastfeeding infants communicate with their mothers through little noises and gestures. Mothers invariably speak back, and a conversation or exchange develops. Feeding provides a context for language learning. Sucking, like speech, is highly organized. These mothers and babies are taking part in a research study led by Harry McGurk.
The baby sucks, pauses, sucks, pauses, sucks, pauses, and all infants show that structure to their sucking. Some have long sucks, some have short sucking bursts, but they all show that structure. Now, what's interesting is that in the feeding situation, the mother seems to adopt a strategy when she's feeding that integrates very finely with that on-off pattern of the baby. That is to say, when the baby's sucking, the mother tends to be relatively passive, and when the infant pauses, she then becomes active and talks to the baby and strokes its cheek, stops, and the baby starts sucking again. Now, with respect to language acquisition, the baby is being integrated into a communicative network that has turn-taking characteristics to it. The baby's turn, the mother's turn, the baby's turn, the mother's turn. And that's a very important aspect, of course, of linguistic communication, conversation.
A baby learns to talk before it can actually talk. Here in Edinburgh, Colwyn Trevathan pioneered techniques for recording these exchanges, or proto-conversations, simultaneously. James is 10 weeks old. His exchanges with his mother involve eye contact and gesture. Is this learned behaviour, we asked Colwyn Trevathan?
The purpose was to get as close a look as possible at both halves of the communication. So we wanted to be able to see everything the baby did in response to the mother, and also all of the mother's expressive behaviour that was exciting the baby, and look at their mutual effects on each other.
Come on then. Where's my smiles gone? Yes. Yes, I thought so. I thought there'd be another smiley. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. I know, and you're blowing bubbles? Yes.
The behaviour of the baby is exceedingly complex. It is inconceivable that that patterning has been learnt or trained. People have talked about that interaction, the turn-taking as if it's proto-conversation. Many of those I see as a reflection of the natural characteristics of the baby's motivations.
Can you bring your hands together for Mummy? What you doing to Mummy?
The real difference between this and any learning theory is the idea that there is an inborn capacity to communicate as a human being, and with many, many features that are embryonic elements of speech and gesture and language communication.
Come on, my sweet.
What about the lovely smile, then?
Yeah. Now, you do clapping your hands.
The smile itself is a kind of behaviour that can't have any effect on the world except through someone else perceiving it. It does express feeling. So babies are expressing the same kinds of feelings as the mother who reflects the affection and smiles back at the baby. But it's important to realise that it's only part of a whole complex of body behaviour of the mother.
Yes. Is it good to say something? What would you say to Mummy?
The quality of her voice, the gentleness and softness of it expresses the same feelings. In fact, you can actually hear a smile in the voice because it changes the physical quality of the sound.
I know, it's terrible. It's my truly.
Trevathan stresses both the innate and the emotional quality of the baby's behaviour. His ideas are challenged by social learning theory. Playing games like hide and seek requires considerable mental development. This little girl, Eloise, is sitting up on her own, exploring the world around her, trying out new sounds. Are they attempts at speech sounds, or do adults interpret the cooing and babbling as speech? Catherine Snow.
Now, it's quite clear if you look at a 6-month-old that many of the things that the 6-month-old does, which are not intentional, like burping or coughing, are treated as intentional and communicative acts by mothers. Mothers say things like, oh, excuse you, or goodness, goodness. They interpret these things as if they're attempts at communication. We, in fact, pull intentionality out of the pre-intentional child such that we push the child into intentionality and very much blur the distinction between the pre-communicative and the truly communicative child.
We begin to look at things like the kinds of attention that very small infants pay to language. We begin to look at things like early evidence that the child is being communicative, and then the ways in which the mother or the caretaker, because it isn't always the mother, the ways in which the caretaker and the child negotiate the meaning of the actions around them. In other words, the ways in which parents ascribe intentionality to their children's early utterances, and the ways in which parents help the child to map intentionality into linguistic form.
Mealtimes are a linguistic minefield. How do you know what the child wants? How do you get them to ask nicely?
They're good, aren't they?
Do functional uses or social uses of language come first? Jean Berko-Gleason.
Those of us who tend to be rather interactionist are stressing these days the fact that language is not only referential. That is, the child doesn't use language just to name things, to say mommy, juice, kitty, table. The child also has social purposes in acquiring language, and I think it's nice to note that the social and interactive uses of language antedate the referential use of language.
In this society, table manners require the frequent use of thank you. It's in everyday routines that babies learn social or conventional uses for language. But thank you isn't the first purely social communication.
In a sense, you might say babies learn sign language before they learn verbal language, because that sign, that bye-bye sign, or I don't know, maybe it's done in different ways in different parts of the world, that comes before words. It comes before the child even says baba.
Do you want some Ovaltine? Yes, I did it.
You will certainly see parents playing thank you games with children, handing things to babies and saying ta, back and forth. I think parents are doing it partly to show other people that they have a socialized child. There is a real social use of language, and it comes way before those first words.
Babies learn the rudiments of communication very young. But language proper begins with meaningful sounds. This crucial stage has been studied by David Crystal.
Well, one of the first things one wants to know about in language acquisition is when does language development actually start? And you can only decide this if you, first of all, have studied the pre-linguistic vocalizations of children, their early crying and cooing and babbling. In fact, when you listen to recordings of children at around about 10 or 11 months of age, often you can't tell what word they're saying exactly, but what you can tell is that it's very definitely an English-sounding sentence or a French-sounding sentence because of the intonation. Now you can hear this if you take as an example the version of a child saying a little phrase, all gone, which is often used after a meal in, I imagine, every language. And if you listen to this here, you'll see immediately the way in which the child begins to almost sing the intonation before he actually practices the word.
What? All gone.
Did you hear the way in which he sang the and then said, gone, obviously aware at that point that there are two aspects of the development of language. Now, it doesn't take long for a child to build on this basis and start to use all kinds of intonation patterns to represent all kinds of different meanings, especially meanings such as surprise or questioning or delight. And you'll hear this on the word dada in this example.
Dada. 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 Yes. Dada. Yes. Dada. Dada. Dada.
Those last two examples are quite interesting. The child was in his cot and he heard his daddy on the stairs outside. As he heard the noise, he said, Dada? Questioning. And then as daddy came into the room, you don't hear it on that tape, he said, Dada, pointing. And then he said, Dada, commanding. Now what you've got there is a kind of question, a kind of statement, and a kind of command. But of course, he hasn't got the grammar of statements, questions, and commands. He's only got intonation and gesture to do it. But it's a pretty efficient communication system nonetheless.
This little boy is on the threshold of talk. What's going on in his mind? Does he have a clear concept of what he wants to say? What comes first, language or thought, is a key dilemma in psychology. This classic search and find experiment with 15-month-old babies reveals that babies with speech solve the problem more readily than those without. Andy Meltzoff explains the theories around language and cognition.
Okay, well, the classic theories, I suppose, are best represented by Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget holds the position that cognition develops before language and that babies have to reach a certain level of cognitive development before they can learn to talk or say anything, and that language and thought are intimately related. Vygotsky more or less holds the opposite point of view, that babies begin to talk and that also affects their cognitive development. Good going! Yeah, oh, you're very good at that, aren't you? Yeah. What we found is that babies begin to use certain words to express meanings just at the point where they're solving those cognitive problems. Just at the level where babies are very interested in these object permanence games where they're trying to find objects under cloths, they then begin to use the word gone. So it's as if they're working on this problem, this very hard problem for them about where objects are when they're gone, when they can't see them anymore, and they probably listen to the adults around them and pick up the word then that encodes that very difficult problem. So they began to use words that relate to problems that are right on the frontiers of solving, the ones that they're currently very, very concerned with. Now we'll try one more over there. You know, hide them again, don't you? Let me have them. Here we go, Beth. One more. Wait a second. Wait. Ready? Beth. Okay. We're working now on whether using the word helps them solve the cognitive problem, or whether just having solved the cognitive problem, it makes them particularly fascinated by why people use this odd sound in at this particular time. So we really still don't know which comes first, language and cognition. And the hypothesis that Alison Gopnik and I are developing is that they really both maybe emerge at about the same time and sort of bootstrap on each other. Here's the keys. Ready? And we're going to go like this. You ready? Put them under here. Move the keys underneath the cloth. Then we're going to move them under this cloth. Then we're going to move them under this cloth. I'm going to bring out my hand. Where do you think they are? That's a good guess, but they're not there. And that's where you looked last time. Now what? Oh, now that's pretty good going. That was a lot harder, wasn't it? Now what? How about just under there for good measure, huh? Oh, you're going to hide the keys yourself, huh?
John Austin was giving the William James lectures at Harvard. And there the question is, what constitutes meeting the felicity conditions on utterance? So the child, interestingly enough, isn't just learning syntax. He isn't just learning to mean, and he isn't just learning how to get things done with things in the world, but he's learning all three of them simultaneously. Each one of them is an enormous accomplishment. And that psycholinguist or linguist who looks at only one of these at a time, looks at the syntactic side, the semantic side, or just the pragmatic side, all in isolation, is bound to develop a theory which has one great big ear and no ear on the other side and no nose or mouth. I mean, you've got to keep these three things in balance, and it's punishingly difficult to do so. And I don't know, I mean, you know, what's the basis for the acquisition of these rule structures or maxim structures? Again, it's some function of mastering the complexities of the environment so that one can assign interpretations to events in a semiotic sense.
Just at this age, between 1 and 2 years old, when babies are let loose to explore, touch, build, they're learning an amazing 7 to 8 words a day and combining them according to the rules of their native language.
Are you making a cake?
Is there an innate basis, a neuropsychological device somewhere in the brain?
Yeah.
Should we be taking more notice how older children and adults prepare babies for language? as Jerome Brunner suggests.
If you take a look at it, the sort of thing that I have written about as formats that are used in language acquisition is, for example, in the referential format, you're very struck by the fact that what the mother is doing is holding the environment very constant in terms of her response to the child. And as the child picks up bits of language under those circumstances, she then imposes an interpretation on what the child is doing so that the child can then predict what the results are of using certain utterance types, particularly what we speak of as the pragmatic or the illocutionary side of language.
Adults create a framework, or as Brunner calls it, scaffolding, for the baby's talk.
Scaffolding is part of this preparation of input or control of input so that the child is not just having a language world thrown at. Remember, Noam early on used, I can't remember whether it was Noam or Jerry Katz, commented on the fact that, as far as it's concerned, the child is essentially, could even learn language on scraps from the language feast that was going on among the adults. That's not so.
What structures are available to children? There's Noam Chomsky's LAD, the language acquisition device, which now has a partner in Jerome Brunner's LAS, the language acquisition support system.
LAD was the language acquisition device in my format, so this language acquisition support system, which I also believe has some innate base, by the way.
Is there any way of proving either theory? You can certainly watch a child in a strange situation and see what language he or she uses. Here at the City University of New York, the scaffolding is described as a script or cognitive model. Diana is 2. She comes here once a week to make a pizza. She's learned all about it in the laboratory. Researcher Joan Lucciarello.
And we were looking to see when she picked up the event knowledge, like what comes next. After you put the flour on the board, you then have to roll out the dough.
Want to roll it?
But we were also looking for acquisition of knowledge about the specific objects, their function in the event, and their names.
Diana is asked to name each object. Does she only use the name when she understands their use? When she has the script in her head?
Did you make a pizza? Where's the sifter? So she'd go from a position of learning them, inserting them into her own conceptual framework, and then using language to talk about that framework.
Very good.
The research here is under the direction of Catherine Nelson.
And it's the cognitive model that the child builds up for the situation that provides the in this case, the scaffolding for the talk. Now the mother, of course, it's not cognitive to the exclusion of social, and we assume that the social aspect is a very important part of it, and that the mother is perhaps vitally important in structuring that situation so that the child understands. But we think our data is very convincing in showing that, in fact, the child's understanding is what's crucial.
We're just going to go to the circus today.
This little girl has never been to the circus. She's given all the information and words concerning circuses by her mother. She plays freely with the toys, but her mother helps her to understand the event, to build the cognitive model, to interpret the language used. The mother enables her daughter to take part in the language game. The audience have taken their seats. Now the animals prepare their acts.
What's this?
I think that is a pen for the doggies. Okay.
They can see the elephants. They can see the elephants.
Okay.
Experiments like these help us to understand the context of language acquisition, but do they explain how children come out with whole phrases and sentences at around the age of 2? Jean Berko-Gleason.
When you say, how do children learn language, it's too simplistic to think that the child is either memorizing great hunks and simply spewing them back, or analyzing everything she or he hears and producing productive language in that sense.
Can you tell me how old you are? When was your birthday?
Jason is 2. Can we really say that he's unresponsive because he doesn't understand? Is it the complicated sentence or the reference to abstract notions like time and date that baffle him? Or do the strange surroundings affect him?
See how I'm cutting it. There, can you see yourself, Jason? I'm just going to cut a little piece off. Here you are, look.
When he's faced with a curl of cut hair, he knows what it means and what word to use.
Go on. Go on.
But they also probably in the early years only learn rather globally the meaning of expressions like it's time for bed now, it's time for your bath now. After, what does that mean to an infant? You hold up a towel in your hand, look at the bathroom and say it's time for your bath now. Does that mean that the 2-year-old or the 1-year-old, the toddler, knows what it's time for, your bath and now all mean and can use those words productively? Certainly not. The child has acquired, in terms of understanding, that very global kind of notion, and I think is true in both comprehension. That is, I think children first begin to associate routinized phrases with the everyday activities in their life, and then later may produce some rather routinized phrases as well without being able to analyze them.
Recently I've been looking at settings that recur frequently for the same child. Routinized settings, things like getting up in the morning or having snack or having a bath, going to bed at night, or reading the same book over and over again. Situations for which you can describe regularities and recurrences and predict what's going to happen in a particular time.
I'll sing this one. 3 blind mice.
Probably the richest data about this comes from children reading books with their parents, where they go back to the same book. In fact, children themselves insist on going back to the same book again and again, often to the distress of the parent. It's quite clear if you look at successive sessions of book reading between one mother-child pair that the things that the mother said about the picture on page 13 at one session recur in the child's speech when looking at that same picture at the next session, or perhaps 2 or 3 sessions later. It's as if the child is storing up how you talk about this picture and reveals the degree to which the language he learns is dependent on the language he has heard only if the situation within which that language has been heard recurs. If the situation doesn't recur, then he might never reveal that learning.
Which one?
They are giving themselves the very best chance to hear the utterance again and again and finally do a proper linguistic analysis of it, the kind of analysis that would feed in to some syntactic acquisition system.
Syntax begins with putting 2 words together according to the rules.
I've got a pumpkin house.
And what's this one?
Keita is nearly 3. Eve Clark wants to find out how she manages the relation between words and concepts.
I have a fruit flower.
And the problem the child has to solve is which concepts go with a word and which ones get grouped together maybe, all with a whole set going with a single word, which concepts maybe are broken up among several words. And working out that mapping relation between concepts and words can take quite a long time.
On my side, I've got a balloon tree. What have you got?
I've got a pencil on my tree.
And what have you got on this one?
Orange.
Okay. Now on my
Well, each time when I held up a card and said what I had on mine, I used a compound noun when I described it. So I would say I've got a pencil house, with stress on pencil and less stress on house. She very consistently used compounds.
A tree house.
For talking about the 2 pictures on her side of the card. So for instance, she said a tree house and a pumpkin house when she looked at the 2 pictures of the other houses. In the picture, the tree and the pumpkin are not really separable from the house. They're made into houses. But there was one picture where they were really 2 separate entities.
Now, on my side, I've got a book chair. What have you got?
I've got a duck on my chair.
You've got a duck on your chair.
I said that I had a book chair, which was a picture of a chair with books lying on top of it, and on her side there were 2 chairs, one with a duck sitting on it and one with spiders on it. And she said, instead of saying that it was a duck chair, said that I've got a duck sitting on my chair. And this typically happens when the 2 objects are not intrinsically related or part of the same thing. So that in fact with other 2- and 3-year-olds we find very consistently that if objects can be thought of as being subcategories, members of the same category, so they're all kinds of houses or all kinds of chairs, say, then children are more likely to use compounds to describe them. But if they're really two separate things that are in accidental juxtaposition, then they will use a phrase or a relative clause or some other kind of description.
Eve Clark tried a more complex task with 4-year-old Melissa, changing word endings to form compounds.
What they seem to learn first is that you can put two words together to make a compound word, and that this can be used for naming categories. Then they discover there are lots of different endings in English, like er or ing, which can also be used to coin words for people, for instruments, for objects of various kinds. A machine that builds walls, yes. What do you think we could call it?
Machine builds walls.
A machine builds walls? Okay. So, could we call it a builder, too? Then adults, given these sorts of cards, will reliably say, for example, for someone who builds a wall, that he's a builder, or someone who breaks bottles, that he's a breaker or a bottle breaker. Young children, when they first start coining words like this, will come up with things like a build wall, which has compound stress on it, so that it is indeed following the kinds of patterns of words that you get in English. But of course a build wall you would assume was a kind of wall, not a person who builds walls. And it takes them a little while to learn that you mustn't say a build wall but a wall builder or a builder in that sort of situation.
Not all children develop these skills in the same way at the same rate. Styles of acquisition have been studied by Elena Leven.
Some children will actually put two words together in a very highly organized way with some kind of underlying rule for how the words ought to be ordered right from the very beginning, the minute they start using more than one word in an utterance. Others seem to learn utterances as whole chunks and perhaps use those chunks for quite a long time without necessarily starting to have rules for putting single words together.
Honey,
Yes.
does he know Daddy Bears?
I think so, yeah. Can we turn the page again?
Oh, yeah.
If you think about a 2-year-old who will be speaking with one word at a time or in rote-learnt phrases, these children are already producing very complicated utterances.
They've forgotten the monkey.
For instance, Keita says, "You've forgotten the monkey," which is actually really quite a complicated sort of sentence.
Oh, yeah.
Good spot by spot.
Just in terms of the sheer syntax of the thing, she's doing something really considerably more advanced than she would have been doing even 4 or 5 months ago. And one of the most fascinating things that you see as children go through this 3rd year is the way in which they start to put into the utterance all the bits and pieces that previously they had to rely on external context or on another speaker or on scaffolding for.
What's under the bed?
A crocodile. What a doll.
There's Spot under the rug. I think we missed a page there.
Oh, no.
I think we missed a page, Joe. We missed the monkey again. Is he in the box?
Oh, no. No, we didn't miss a monkey again.
Didn't we?
No.
The other thing is the ease with which they're carrying on a conversation that moves in and out of the present.
Oh, what's in the box?
I've got a bear apple.
Have you?
Yes.
What's he eating?
She can talk about, "I've got a bear at home," quite easily. Now that's something that, again, she would have had to have said bear and rely on someone else to say, "Have you got a bear at home?" Or, "Yes, you have got a bear at home, haven't you?"
What do you usually have?
Just Spot.
Just Spot, nothing else.
No.
There are rules that are available to all children in some sense for helping them to work out the grammar of the language that they're learning. But what I'm trying to argue is that how children use those rules may vary. The strength of particular rules may vary for different children.
Is he behind the door?
No.
What's behind the door?
Teddy bear. A big teddy bear eating honey.
One thing that's quite plain is that if they take the view that everything depends upon the early learning of the world, as to say, acquisition of world knowledge and acquisition of, how shall I say, social skills, interactive skills, and point to gestures and vocalizations, those people tend grossly to overlook the complexity of language as its own problem space. You may know a lot about the target world, but you still have got to know how to handle the preterite and when to use a definite and an indefinite article and that kind of thing. That's still a problem space.
Learning to build grammar is a complex and highly abstract problem. These 3- and 4-year-olds speak English. By studying other languages, say Turkish or Russian, languages with lots of inflections, the problem facing the developing child is even more apparent. We asked a specialist in cross-linguistic analysis to explain, Dan Slobin.
But we must remember that the child doesn't come into the English-speaking world ready to hear separate English words. The child hears a stream of sound. It's rather hard to realize that in your own language, but let me give you an example from another language. Say, in Turkish, if you wanted to say something like the cat is on the mat, you would say, Kedi halının üstünde. Now, I would imagine if you don't know Turkish, you don't even hear the words. If I were to write it out as a series, we would have Kedi halının üstünde. But the Turkish-speaking child, from hearing these words separately and in a number of different utterances, begins to hear that there are separate words. We'll hear that there's kedi, which means cat. There's halı, which means rug or mat. There's üstün, which means top. And some other little pieces. There's a piece here, de, which means something like at. And there's a piece here, nın, which is like the possessive s. It means something like the cat, the mat's top at. The cat is at the top of the mat. That already requires a whole perceptual apparatus for language processing. Hearing words, hearing bits of words, taking them apart, storing them. We then have a semantic level of trying to figure out what these words refer to. Some of the words refer to things in the world, like cat and mat. Some of them have relational meanings, like possessive or located at, or in relation in such a way that one is at the top of another. The child must very early on separate out these different levels of processing. While looking for meanings of words, also look for relational meanings. And the child must come equipped with some expectation that parts of words and orders of words have an overarching significance, a significance that has to do with more general categories than just the meanings of words.
Whatever the language or social situation, it seems that children adopt similar strategies to organize words and parts of words, the grammar.
Should we pick it up and see?
But children often make mistakes. We asked Dan Slobin whether these mistakes actually indicate that they know how to work out the grammar.
Yes, let me give you a couple of examples to show how children are working both on a semantic level and on a level that's purely formal and has nothing to do with meaning. For example, in many languages, we have rules that are purely there because the language requires certain kinds of forms. For example, in Spanish, the word for bottle is botella. It ends in an a. And if you want to say a bottle, you have to say una botella. Una botella. You have an a here and an a here. Now, children seem to be sensitive to this regularity in the language because where the language doesn't match this pattern, children will impose the pattern anyway. So, for example, in Spanish, the word for flower is una flor. Notice that doesn't match this pattern. We have an a here and no a here. Children will say una flora. This is an error, but notice it's a creative error. It's not something children have imitated. In a sense, it's wrong, but it's wrong in a sense that shows that the child is right. Clearly, part of the time, children are just trying to figure out non-semantic, non-communicative, formal parts of the language.
What colour's your tray going to be? A pink tree? Gosh. Go on then, put it down.
But many grammatical endings relate to meaning, relate to fairly abstract meanings. And here we find that children interpret these meanings in a common way across languages. Let's take Russian, where the word for book is kniga. So if I say the book is interesting, I'll simply say kniga. But if I say pick up the book, read the book, give me the book, I'll say knigu, changing the a to an u. And the u here indicates that the book is the object. Children very early on notice this difference between a and u, and they will say both kniga and knigu. They'll use the distinction in a semantically motivated way. So they figured out that the difference has something to do with meaning.
But meaning for a child is not always what adults intended.
Why?
I think she's going to eat him for a dinner.
In Russian adult speech, if you say something like, I read the book, or I see the book, you would still use the object marker because it's the book that you're acting upon. But for children, somehow reading and seeing is not a direct action.
Mama can do it.
To them, acting on something is doing something with your hands, picking it up, dropping it, throwing it, manipulating it in some way. So in child speech, if they say, read me the book, or see the book, or look at the book, they don't put the object marker on. They say kniga instead of knigu. So here we have a subtle interplay between semantics and grammar. I've suggested from work I've done cross-linguistically that there's a beginning level of what I call basic child grammar, which is remarkably similar now across several dozens of different kinds of languages in very different kinds of societies.
Is there an innate mechanism for language? A basic child grammar which is gradually revised? Chanting nursery rhymes is more sophisticated than it sounds. Learning a language involves considerable expertise and understanding, all developed in the first 4 years of life.
It's perfectly apparent that in addition to the child's knowledge of the language and the detailed sense of what goes into a sentence-like structure, the child also has a very, very deep implicit knowledge of what constitutes a text, a narrative, an event structures as depicted, and how they can become dramatized, and how you forefront certain things and put things into the background. Nobody learns that through induction just from experience. Scratch us, and somewhere down in the genome there's also a dramatist as well as a linguist.
Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. When down came a spider, who sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet.
So that's where some of us are. Some of us are saying, what does the language acquisition device consist of, and what kinds of interaction with other human beings do you need in order to get your language acquisition abilities going?
Chomsky set us on the right track by making it clear that the child has to have some very specialized acquisition devices in order to work out a formal and abstract system like grammar. What's been added since has been attempts to relate that system to issues of semantics, of conceptual development, of communication.
I think the deepest insight about language acquisition is the insight that children are not learning a linguistic system, but that they're acquiring a means of communicating, and that we need to analyze at least the early stages of children's language as attempts at communication.
When we say the medium is the message, the medium is also something that in itself we care about. We come to love words.